Okay, everyone, can people hear me okay? Great. We're going to get started. We've got a hybrid event for this webinar on location in Darwin, where I'm not, at the Lucky Bat Cafe. People are listening in, plus online, but we do want to get started straight away if we can, because we've got a tight schedule. So my name's Kirsty Howie. I'm one of the co-directors of the Environment Centre of the Northern Territory, and I welcome you all here this evening, wherever you're listening from, to this fascinating webinar. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from unceded Larrakia country, and I'd like to pay respects to their care and custodianship of these lands and waters, where part of the infrastructure supporting the proposed Barossa project is located in Darwin Harbour. And I also want to acknowledge the Tiwi traditional owners on whose waters the Barossa project will be located. On the 31st of March 2021, Santos announced that a final investment decision had been made to proceed with the Barossa project, taking many people by surprise, including in the Northern Territory. And while the national focus vis-a-vis Northern Territory gas has been firmly on the Beetaloo Basin for some years, Territorians know that this is just one of many current or projected gas projects in the Territory. INPEX is, of course, the latest and most famous, but relevant to this evening's webinar, ConocoPhillips established a gas processing facility in Darwin in the early 2000s, with gas piped from the Bayu-Undan gas field in the Timor Sea. Santos acquired ConocoPhillips Northern Australian assets last year with a plan to switch to a new gas field, the Barossa, to backfill the Darwin LNG facility when the Bayu-Undan ran out of gas. The final investment decision was celebrated by Territory's Labor government, by the opposition, by our federal politicians, as an unequivocally positive project for the Territory. But what exactly are we buying into with the Barossa project? Despite taxpayer funds being funneled to gas-fire our economy, is it too late for gas? Perhaps most significantly and existentially, as the Territory experiences severe impacts from climate change, why are we embarking upon a project that will exacerbate this catastrophic trajectory? We have a panel tonight of brilliant experts here to make sense of the Barossa project and to convince you why we should all be very worried about it. And I want to start first by introducing Jason Fowler, who's a marine scientist based in the Northern Territory, who will talk about the marine values of the region and the threats posed by the project. So just excuse me while I do some footwork changing the screen, and I'll let Jason take over from here.
Thanks so much for that lovely introduction, Kirsty. Just really briefly, I've been sailing around this area for a long time now, and I've been around the Tiwi Islands many times, and I can say from a personal point of view, it's a really lovely part of the world. It's very beautiful indeed. So the Barossa Field, the Barossa gas field is some 260 kilometres north of Darwin. It's about 100 kilometres north of the top of the Tiwi Islands where it begins. The field itself lies adjacent to the Galdita field and another big field called Evans Shoals. So you have to remember that the Barossa is the first stage, and then there's second stage and a third stage. So there's quite a bit of gas out there that they want to get access to. And the Barossa is opened up, where that sort of opens the pathway to develop the other fields as well. So in that area where the Barossa field is, there's two major fisheries. There is the offshore snapper fishery and the Timor Reef fishery. These are both pretty well managed fisheries. They've been around for a long time. And all the tropical snappers you see in the supermarket in Coles and Woolies are from those two fisheries. And I believe those two fisheries will face impacts from this development. In that area, you have two major ocean currents. You've got the Holloway current and the Indonesian through flow current. And they both take waters from sort of northeast down to the southwest. So if there was any kind of spill or pollution which was leaked out of the field, it would travel down the coast, around the Kimberley coast and off into the Indian Ocean. Now we saw this impact when the Montara spill happened a good many years ago now, and that reached the shores of Timor and Roti. So it really shows how these ocean currents can carry things a long way. Recently, there's been a lot of research showing the impacts of seismic testing. We've had a major Senate inquiry into it. It's that serious. And with Australian Institute of Marine Science done a lot of work on the northwest out of Broome and also down towards Onslow. And they're showing that a new sort of discovery is that zooplankton is particularly impacted by seismic testing. To me, this is no surprise. If you're a little animal living in the water column, like a little fish larvae, and you're only a few millimeters long, and you get an air gun fired next to you, it's going to do a lot of damage. If you're a huge animal, like a whale, you can certainly move away a lot quicker and get away from these kinds of impacts, but little animals can't. So to develop this field, it means a lot of seismic testing, really intensive seismic testing to really understand where the gas is. And I suspect that would lead to a lot of impacts in that region and potentially impact those two major fisheries that lie over that area. I'll just touch on the pipeline corridor itself, which I consider to be particularly troublesome. If you just go to the next slide there, Kirsty, this pipeline corridor, it runs all the way down past the coast of the Tiwi Islands. It runs right through the Oceanic Shoals Marine Park. So I have to mention that marine park. It's probably the most one of the most important marine parks in Northern Australia. The reason for this is the Oceanic Shoals sits on the Sahel Shelf, it's the edge of the Australian continent. It's risen and fallen many times with ice ages, and it's had periods of intense reef building activity, and then other periods where it's risen up. The sea level's fallen because of ice ages. There's been big rivers cut big valleys through it. So today we're left with flooded river valleys. It's dominated by big pinnacles, big valleys, incredible habitat. It's totally dominated by big sponge gardens and coral reefs, and it's a really amazing part of the northern coast of Australia. For this reason, for a very good reason, it was put into the Oceanic Shoals Marine Park. It became law in 2018 when they finalised the management plans. And as you can see, excuse me, from the diagram, the pipeline will have to cut through about 30 kilometres of the general use zone in the marine park, and then through about 31 kilometres of the habitat protection zone, which is the yellow bit you can see on the map there, and gets very close to the green bit, which is actually a sanctuary zone, the most highly protected part of the marine park. Now, the reason why you create a habitat protection zone is so that you don't damage the habitat. And to build a pipeline of this scale, you do have to do a lot of habitat modification. Now, the Director of National Parks, Parks Australia, he gave this an in-principle agreement quite a few years ago now. And I think that decision was a bit rushed, and I think it should be revisited. The reason for this is, if you go to the next slide, you'll see that when you go to lay a pipeline of this magnitude, there's a lot of infrastructure you need to do. If you can imagine like laying a new railway through a rugged part of Australia, you've got to move hills out of the road. You've got to build bridges over valleys. So they do this by laying down a lot of concrete on the bottom. They put these big spans in place. They dredge over areas, and they lay a big pipeline, which is basically half a metre in diameter. It's coated in concrete. It's made of steel. It's a pretty solid bit of kit. It's got to be fairly level. It's got to be fairly straight to work properly. And they have to be able to get to it over and over and over to fix it up in case something goes wrong. So you're talking about a solid 9-month process, just laying this pipeline down with massive impacts that go with that. And I don't believe that is consistent with the idea that habitat protection zones are in place in Australia, all around Australia. And I feel that this is in clear violation of the intention of the marine parks. I don't believe they have the social license to do this. You consider that a few years ago, we had a massive public debate about the Commonwealth marine parks. Some 50,000 submissions were handed in the end from Australians, and the vast majority of them were calling for strong protections in these marine parks. And yet a couple of years down the track, we allow a big gas pipeline to be built through one. Not only one, it's probably the most important one in Northern Australia. Now, when they finish building this pipeline, they have to actually flood or deflood the pipeline. So if you look at the bottom corner there, you've got a thing called a pig. It's like a giant plug. And they stick it in the pipeline. They pump a whole cocktail of chemicals in that pipe. And a lot of those chemicals are pretty dangerous. There's biocides to kill anything in there. And there's oxygen scavengers to make sure there's no oxygen left in the pipe to prevent corrosion. So they push this pig all the way down the pipeline and literally scour the pipe clean and blow everything out the other end. Now you'd think that they would actually collect the chemical at the other end, but they don't. They just blow it out into the ocean. And that's in the Barossa Field. They blow it north, not near the coast, but out into the ocean, under the premise that it'll get quickly diluted down and it won't do much impact. I'm particularly concerned about this. If you're a fish larvae or crustacean larvae out there and you get hit with some biocides, you're in trouble, without a doubt. And I'm sure there's localized impacts and strong currents out there too. So it could carry a lot further than what we believe. I don't think that the research on that area for the pipeline is adequate. And I think they need to do a lot more work on that. Now we go to the next slide. You can sort of gives you an idea of the amount of activity that's going to happen. So this pipeline goes for 70 kilometres down the coast of the Tiwi Islands and comes within 6 kilometres of the corner of Bathurst Island on the western side of the Tiwis. So all of these vessels that you can see are going to be running up and down the edge of the Tiwis. These are massive ships, absolutely enormous. If you want an example of this, I strongly suggest people fly to Broome. Go to Broome, go to Dampier Peninsula, Beagle Bay, Lombardina, One Arm Point, and you'll get a feel for what it's like when oil and gas comes to town. I've spent most of my life in Broome. Usually it was a sleepy little holiday town, but today it's a very noisy oil and gas town that supplies the Browse Basin, which is some 450 kilometres offshore. There's heavy lift choppers flying out 2 to 3 times a day. The airport's incredibly noisy to get crew out there, and then there's all these vessels that come and go all the time as well. Now imagine this applied to the quite sleepy and very beautiful Tiwi Islands. It's going to certainly totally transform what it's like to be on the Tiwis. And I think that this is something that hasn't been well considered in this debate. And I've been speaking to some of the rangers up in the Tiwis and a few other people, and it seems that they weren't very well consulted. I can't find much evidence of thorough consultation before this decision. As a matter of fact, there was only 7 submissions for this pipeline proposal. One of them was one that I did. So it seems that the consultation process was very lacking. And I would strongly suggest that the company needs to go out to the Tiwis and really provide a lot more information so that Tiwi Islanders can make a really informed decision about this. Now, the reason why I say this is because just recently the Tiwi Islands or Tiwi Land Council, they received some funding to create an Indigenous protected area, an IPA, over the Tiwi Islands and right down to the low tide mark around the islands, which is a fantastic outcome. And right now, the Tiwi Islanders are all getting together. They're writing a healthy country plan and they're working out how they're going to manage their new IPA, which is managed for protection or conservation values. Now, this is stage 1 of an IPA. They also have strong aspirations to apply for some more funding from the Commonwealth Government and develop stage 2 of the IPA, which is a sea country IPA around the islands. Now, this has been done in other areas, for example, off Nhulunbuy and Groot Island over to the east. There's massive IPAs around in the sea country around these places. Now, the IPAs extend out to 12 nautical miles, which is the edge of the Australian territorial waters. So you know, I'm quite sure the Tiwi Islanders would want their IPA to go right out, well beyond, you know, as far as you can see, and put that area into conservation, because it is incredibly beautiful, and the Tiwis are surrounded by reefs and, you know, a lot of coral and a lot of life. But now you have a big gas pipeline cutting right through it, coming within 6 kilometres of the islands. And so what does that mean for their IPA? How does that change it? You can't really manage it for conservation when you've got a huge gas pipeline going through it. And I don't think that has been explored properly. And I've been encouraged the Santos to go out there and actually, you know, dive into that one and see what the Tiwi Land Council really think. Now, there's another area of protection there as well, which is there is a huge reef fish protection zone put in by NT Fisheries, NT government. And that was done to protect golden snapper and northern jewfish stocks. It's a very important protection zone. And currently we can't go there and bottom fish and catch reef fish off that area. And that's also impacted by this gas pipeline. What does that mean? You know, how can they do that and you know, damage another zone we put in place to protect our fish stocks? Some big questions there that are unanswered. And it brings me to my final sort of risk. There's a huge amount of risk. Sorry, I'm just touching on them quite quickly. Turtles. If we just go to the next slide, the Tiwi Islands should be called the Turtle Islands. It is absolutely dominated by turtles on the beaches. Incredible place. From this slide, you can see on the very corner, there is a little red part of the coast, and that's the highest concentration of nesting turtles that they found in 10 years worth of surveys. And that is also exactly the point where the pipeline goes really close to the Tiwis. Now, the key species in that area is olive Ridley turtles, which are quite rare, to be honest, and I think they're vulnerable listed from memory. And those beaches on that coast are really important to olive Ridley turtles. They're also super important to flatback turtles, just to name 2 of them. Now, the Australian government have a national marine turtle recovery plan that's been nutted out for years, and it's something we should really stick to, because our turtles are, you know, they're in a lot of trouble in a lot of areas. Now, that plan clearly says that there should be a 20-kilometre buffer zone around really important nesting areas, exactly like the west coast of the Tiwi Islands. And yet here we have a plan to build a massive gas pipeline right next to it. There hasn't been enough research done. There's only really 2 efforts of survey that I know of in that area. We strongly suspect that the bottom habitat there is quite muddy. It's full of mud whelks, which are little shells that live in the mud. Olive Ridley turtles have very strong beaks. They love eating shells off the bottom. And, you know, we've discovered this in the past where we found dead olive Ridleys and their bellies are full of mud whelks. So we strongly suspect that is why that area is a key nesting site, is because they've got the perfect beaches and they've got the perfect feeding grounds really close to it. So, you know, I would encourage Santos and the Australian government to do a lot more research here and really nut out whether this is going to have an impact on one of our most important turtle species by going ahead with this proposal. Anyway, I've probably talked for long enough. That's a few of it gives you an idea of the impacts that and the risks that might be, you know, come about from this proposal. I'll let someone else have a go.
Thanks so much, Jason. That was really fascinating and troubling, to be honest. I will stop sharing my screen so that Bruce can share his. And I will introduce Bruce Robertson, who many of you will know from all of his incredible media appearances and research that he puts out, and he's so prolific. So we're very grateful to have your expertise here tonight, Bruce. So yeah, just introducing Bruce Robertson from the Institute for Energy, Economics and Financial Analysis to talk about the emissions profile of the Barossa. Thank you. You're on mute, Bruce.
Committed the cardinal sin of a Zoom meeting. I'm sorry about that. Thank you very much, Kirsty. It's a very generous introduction. Look, my talk tonight is entitled "The Barossa Carbon Bomb," and the subtitle is "No Future in CO2 Production." Look, we have a guest contributor at EFA called John Robert, and he actually wrote a report on Barossa, the emissions from Barossa, and he quipped in that report that Barossa is a CO2 project with LNG as a byproduct, and it's actually there's a lot of truth to that. It is the most carbon dioxide intensive gas field of any of the ones that have been developed globally recently. I think it's important to sort of go out from Barossa first of all and have a look what's happening globally. Globally, methane emissions are growing strongly, and that's simply not aligned with any climate commitments. Barossa will produce the most greenhouse gas intensive LNG in the world. And whilst Australia rushes to extract more gas, we have the EU looking at putting in carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which are basically carbon taxes, but levied on foreigners. They're a carbon tariff, if you like. So we will get, it is likely that the US will do something very similar, and a number of other countries will follow in their footsteps. Obviously, that will introduce a carbon price in Australia by default. The pace of technological change has picked up rapidly in recent times, and we're seeing, particularly for battery technology and particularly for grid scale batteries, to firm up power systems globally, we're going to see a lot of battery projects get installed in the short term. And these are massive compared to the old ones. Now, the other thing that's happening is we're getting very big competition from Qatar, who is very, very low cost producer. And the final thing is gas demand is actually falling. It's falling in Australia, it's falling in the US, and it's beginning to fall globally as climate commitments are tightening the screws. And we've only just seen the start of that with the Biden Climate Summit. There's also the G7 meeting coming up where more climate announcements will be made. And so really gas has a rather troubled future. Here's a graph of global methane emissions. Global methane emissions are about 25% of all greenhouse gas emissions globally are methane. And as you can see, those emissions are growing strongly. Now, the key point here is net zero means we've got to turn that graph around and get global emissions falling. Rising emissions are not falling emissions. Now, net zero commitments means we've got to do the same for CO2. So all in all, at the moment, what we're seeing is rising emissions, and we need to see falling emissions. Up is not down. And it's a really basic point that we really have to get through to our political and media classes, that despite all the claims of, you know, we've got falling emissions in Australia, for example, and US claims they've got falling emissions, well, it's not showing through in the added up figures. This is a great graph, because what it really shows is that we can't expand gas and magically meet Paris climate commitments. What this graph shows is that for developed reserves, we've actually got to decrease production over time. And this graph doesn't even show undeveloped reserves as being a thing. Barossa is an undeveloped reserve. Much like a lot of the other gas fields we're looking at developing. We simply can't afford to develop these reserves and meet Paris climate commitments. What I'm trying to explain here is that to get to 1.5 degrees, to have a chance of getting to 1.5 degrees, it's only a chance, we've got to do an awful lot more than we're doing. This was highlighted in the UN production gap report. And what essentially it shows is that we've got to be somewhere in that purple zone. And at present, we're somewhere along that red line at the top upwards. So to get to 1.5 degrees, we roughly need to reduce gas production by 6% per year. So we've got to halve it, essentially, over that time period in that out to 2040. We've got to halve gas production from current levels. Now, no one in Australia is talking about doing any such thing. That we're talking about increasing radically gas production in Australia under the gas-fired recovery. Now, this is the emissions from Barossa. Essentially, what it shows is that for every tonne of LNG produced, just under 1.5 tonnes of CO2 are produced. So we're seeing more carbon dioxide equivalent tonnes produced than LNG produced out of this project. And as you can see, it's far more emissions intensive even than the Ichicus project, which is off Darwin and which is a pretty emissions intensive project itself. It's obviously more than 3 times something like Pluto off the Northwest Shelf. The Northwest Shelf project itself, it's more than 3 times that. It's more than 3 times Wheatstone, and so it really is a shocker. And John Roberts' paper clearly demonstrates that. So the total emissions, if you add them all up from all the various layers, and this is the whole thing about this project, you get emissions vented offshore before the gas is put in the pipeline to come ashore. You get offshore flaring and combustion, and so the total offshore emissions are 3.38 million tonnes. And the total emissions, once you include the Darwin LNG plant, are 5.44. Now, the whole project only produces 3.7 million tonnes of gas a year. So it's incredibly emissions intensive. What this slide shows is that, and again, it's from John Roberts' work on emissions at Barossa. What it shows is essentially that over time, between 2014 and 2019, we've had a boom in LNG production. And what it shows is that the intensity, the carbon intensity, the amount of emissions produced per tonne of gas has increased. And so we're seeing a lot more carbon dioxide produced. The emissions intensity has gone from 0.54 of a tonne of CO2 per tonne of LNG to 0.7. So we've had a 40-odd% increase in emissions intensity of new projects. And the reason for this is pretty simple. It's a lot cheaper to produce gas if you don't have a lot of CO2 in the gas stream. You don't have to get rid of the CO2. So basically the low CO2 fields have all been developed, and now we're scraping the bottom of the barrel. And it's a really important point to note that gas going forward is more emissions intensive than it has been historically. And we've got to get that in our heads, because clearly people don't. And here you are. This compares it not only to the other Australian projects up the top, which is this is just simply in the gas reservoir, how much volume of CO2 there is. But the second bunch of people is the offshore competition. It's Qatar gas, Nigeria, Oman, Atlantic, and you can see they're all relatively low CO2 fields compared to the extremely high Barossa Field, which is, you know, about 8 or 9 times higher than Qatar gas. It's you know, over 9 times higher than Nigeria LNG. You know, these are big numbers more CO2 out of Barossa. It really is a carbon bomb. You're not going to get the boom in Darwin in jobs that you got from Ichthys. Quite simply, the platform is the floating production and storage ship that is actually on the Barossa gas field is fabricated offshore, and there'll be virtually no plant or equipment constructed in Darwin for Barossa. And so, you know, it's not really going to do it for Darwin. Is the essential point here. We are going to see carbon tariffs come in, as I said before, and I think the key point is they're going to come in at a very high level, and the reason for that is currently in Europe, carbon emissions permits via the EU emissions trading scheme are trading for about 70 to 80 Australian dollars a tonne. So, you know, if we get a de facto carbon, you know, if this comes in here, we're obviously going to get hit with a very high price. And the competition, what is a competition for this field? It's Qatar. Qatar's planning a 64% production expansion. It's already the second largest, only by a whisker behind Australia, LNG producer in the world. It was the largest. It is going to retake that crown, obviously, quite clearly with this massive expansion. And it's cut prices around 22% to get some of that deals away. Qatar can afford to do that. It's a way lower cost producer than anything Australia can produce at. It really does have pretty much the perfect conditions for LNG production. The fields are close to shore, they're in shallow water, and they're really productive fields. So it really has a triumphant in terms of costs. It's very difficult to compete against. On a positive note, batteries are a thing now for electricity in a big way. And if we have a look at the battery cost deflation, and I think that this is possibly the most interesting point, is it's far faster than either solar or wind, both of which experience massive falls in costs. Batteries falls in costs are much steeper, much faster, and we're seeing a flood of battery projects come into the Australian market and the US market right now. And they will be constructed relatively fast. They're pretty quick to get going. Only a couple of months ago, Neon gave the final investment decision for a 300 megawatt battery in Victoria, and it will be complete and operational by November. So they're fast. Once the decision is made to put them in, they're very quick to actually come into production. And we are going to see an awful lot more than Neon's 300 megawatt one. Just to put that in context, at the time the Tesla big battery was actually commissioned, it was only 100 megawatts. So this one is 3 times the size of the Tesla big battery that was the biggest battery in the world at the time. There are others that are being proposed at the moment that are 10 and 12 times the size of the Tesla big battery. Grid scale batteries are a thing now, and they're going to happen fast. Domestic consumption in Australia is down 16% since 2014. And the interesting thing is, even in the US, which is an extraordinarily cheap market for gas, gas is very cheap in the US. Even there, the US Energy Information Administration, which is an extremely conservative government body, is forecasting falls in gas consumption, not only in 2020 in the year of COVID, but coming out of COVID. And what's interesting is that the falls going forward that they have are precipitated by large falls in the usage of gas in the power system. You're seeing a rebound there in 2021 in industrial and residential consumption, but there will be large falls in electric power. So this really is a total change of outlook to what we've seen for the last 4 or 5 years, where pretty much the only way was up for gas consumption in the US. And really, that's the end of my talk. So thank you very much today for listening.
That was incredible, Bruce. And thank you so much for giving us the reality check we all need about these projects and the claims that are made about the economic benefits for places like the Northern Territory, as well as the catastrophic impacts, environmental impacts associated with them. I'll pass on now to Liam Carter. So Liam is a rising star at the Australia Institute. And the Australia Institute, like IEFA, is a great friend to the Northern Territory, providing really incisive and cutting research that pushes back against the dominant frames of northern development that we hear so often here. And so Liam will be discussing corporate responsibility, government policy in that regard, and the economics of gas projects. So thank you, Liam. I forgot you actually don't have slides. You'll just be talking. Thank you.
That's right. Well, hi, everyone. And thank you very much, Kirsty, for that glowing introduction. I'm going to have to live up to it now, so I'm a little bit worried. So thanks also to the Environment Centre NT for hosting this. I want to acknowledge the Larrakia people, the traditional owners of the Darwin area, as well as the Tiwi people. Pay my respects to elders past and present. I also want to acknowledge that I'm dialing in from Canberra, which is Ngunnawal territory, and I want to pay my respects to the elders past and present from here as well. We consistently hear from governments and industry that fossil fuels are good for power and good for jobs and good for the economy. And if you question that, the implication is that you obviously don't understand economics and you should just pipe down and trust them. And that's what gas companies have done for a while. And that's what they're doing right now with the gas-fired recovery. And that's exactly what they're doing with the Barossa project now as well. So we need to tackle head on, in my view, the economic fallacy that the oil and gas industry is good for Australia. And that's essentially what I'm here to do, to talk about both the Barossa project, but then also the economics of oil and gas more broadly in Australia as well. So Bruce and Jason have just run through how terrible this project is from a climate and environmental point of view, but it also poses huge economic problems as well. Because the fact is that gas isn't good for Australia and it isn't good for the economy. It's good for gas companies who want to make mega profits, and it suits them nicely to pretend that their interests and the community interests align, when in reality, nothing could actually be further from the truth. So in fact, the gas industry barely contributes to Australia's budget as a whole, or to employment. They pollute the environment, and essentially what they do is they just pocket the profits and walk away, all the while telling us that we should be grateful because they're growing the economy. And the Barossa project is no different. In fact, as Bruce said, it's potentially even the worse, well, it's potentially even worse rather from an emission standpoint as well. Well, it's about time, in my view, that we actually dug into what the gas industry really does to Australia and cut through some of the nonsense talking points that we hear from gas executives and governments as well. So the very first one that I think we need to address is whether oil and gas companies pay any tax at all. Spoiler alert, they don't, or at the very least, they pay very, very little of it. So you might have seen in the news recently, Shell, which you would imagine would well and truly have the profits to be able to be paying corporate tax in Australia. They're paying no tax, and they're also projecting, they're very honest about it, that they don't expect to be paying tax, even on WA's Gorgon project, which is currently Australia's largest. Likewise, Woodside doesn't pay any tax in Australia, ExxonMobil, no tax, and neither did ConocoPhillips, which was the original proponent of the Barossa Project as well. Santos as well, paid no tax. They do have small subsidiaries such as their WA operations, which paid a very small amount of tax, I think 3 million in the last year or so. But overall, they're actually paying very, very little tax, particularly into the federal coffers there as well. But despite this, Australians generally believe that oil and gas companies pay way more tax than they actually do. My colleagues at the Australia Institute conducted some polling nationwide on the perception of how much revenue oil and gas companies actually contributed to the budget. And on average, people thought that oil and gas revenue made up about 10.8% of the national budget. In reality, it's 0.2%. Which in other words is only 1.15 billion of the total 485 billion. And that means that on average, Australians are overestimating the tax paid by oil and gas companies by a factor of around 46. And that doesn't happen accidentally. Companies and governments have spent a very, very long time talking about the importance of gas. And that has implications in that gas companies receive a social license to operate that they simply don't deserve. The good news is that they appear to be losing that social license, and we're all certainly doing our best to help that process along on its merry way. The other main economic fallacy that I do want to talk about here as well is this idea that projects like these create jobs, and you'll often see political leaders out there in hard hats, particularly around election time, announcing these new jobs for the local community. Oil and gas extraction is highly capital intensive. So it uses a lot of machinery and infrastructure, but it actually employs very, very few people. But contrary to that, gas companies and governments as well consistently exaggerate the importance of the gas industry as an employer. And the same goes for mining as well. For the Territorians in the room, you may have noticed recently the Chief Minister, Michael Gunner, posted on Facebook saying that proudly that the mining sector was the Territory's biggest employer. It's blatantly false. Northern Territory mining, I actually checked about half an hour before I came on this webinar. Mining in the NT employs about 3,500 people. Healthcare employs about 25,000. Education and training employs around 9,000. So it's not even close to being the biggest employer in the Northern Territory. But for some reason, we keep on seeing this exaggerated over and over again. And this sort of fudging is repeated when we talk about oil and gas as well. As an industry, it actually has one of the lowest job intensity rates in all of Australia. So oil and gas extraction produces fewer jobs than industries such as education by around about a factor of 15 or so. So that is to say that for every $1 million that gets pumped in, almost 16 jobs exist in education and training, about 12 jobs exist in healthcare, but for every $1 million that you pump in, not even one job exists in oil and gas. It's about 0.5 of one job. So by that measure, oil and gas is literally the worst industry in Australia in terms of value for money when it comes to creating jobs. But again, we see a discrepancy here between the perceptions and reality as well. So we conducted national polling at the Australia Institute that found that Australians thought that oil and gas employed, on average, about 8.2% of all Australians. It actually employs 0.2% of the 12.5 million people employed in Australia. So that's one aspect to keep in mind, particularly when gas executives and sort of local MPs want to bring this up around local jobs. But the other aspect to oil and gas jobs is the fact that all of the data shows that when the going gets tough, the gas industry actually sacks workers. So over the last year or so, the gas workforce declined by 10%. And you might say, well, fair enough, they were in a pandemic, but at the same time, they were recording record production levels as well. So if you imagine that statistic of 10% reduction in the workforce was replicated across the entire economy, if every industry had reacted to the pandemic by cutting their workforce like the gas industry did by 10%, at the moment, we'd have an extra 1.3 million unemployed people on top of what we currently have. And we'd also have an unemployment rate of around about 15%. But thankfully, other industries are significantly more resilient than the oil and gas industry. And there was a uniform reduction of only around 1.5% across the pandemic. So to put this in a more local context as well, last year, Chevron, they cut 410 jobs, which is actually 1/4 of their entire Australian workforce. Shell cut 9,000 jobs globally, but we don't have the data, unfortunately, on how many in Australia. Woodside cut 1,200 jobs, Impex 465, Santos cut at least 150 jobs, but they also had a so-called reduction in contingent workforce that is very, very well hidden, and we've been unable to source the exact number for how many, but we know that at least 150 people have lost their jobs from Santos in the last year alone as well. So essentially what I'm saying there is gas is volatile, and when the going gets tough, they sack their workers first. So that should put a nice big pin through that particular economic argument. Another issue as well is the issue of offshore rig abandonment. And the cost of decommissioning for Australia's offshore oil and gas infrastructure over the next 40 years or so is conservatively estimated to be over $40 billion. And inevitably, some of this is going to be picked up by the taxpayer. The prime example of this is the Northern Endeavour floating facility, which is, I'm trying to think of nice words, but essentially it's a rust bucket floating around in the sea. And it's staffed by a minimum crew to essentially stop it from catching on fire or crashing into something. So what happened with that was the owners managed to put it into the caretakership of a smaller company. Long story short, that smaller company then went broke, and the tab is now being picked up by the Australian taxpayer as well. And this is something that Australia has a particularly poor record with as well. We have a really poor record for not just offshore, but also onshore mines as well. Across all of Australia, there's about 60,000 abandoned mine sites that are yet to be rehabilitated. So what this represents is a clear and present danger. And while the department federally has made some welcome moves towards preventing it from happening again, nothing substantial has yet occurred to reassure us that essentially we're not going to be picking up the tab when all of these projects come to rest in 30 to 40 years. So despite all of this, governments across Australia are still subsidising fossil fuels to insane amounts. My colleagues at the Australia Institute released a report earlier this week, actually, that found that fossil fuels were subsidised by state and federal governments to the tune of $10.3 billion over the last financial year. Northern Territory budget alone by the NT government was about $107 million in fossil fuel subsidies. But back to that 10.3 billion figure nationally, I don't know about yourselves, but I often find sort of billions and billions, it's very hard to quantify and imagine how much that really is. So to put it in perspective, that's $19,686 per minute, every minute of every single day for the year. And so by the time I finish speaking today, the governments across Australia will have spent around $200,000 to $300,000 on fossil fuel subsidies, just to put that really in perspective for you. So essentially what we're seeing here is governments and these companies committed to a boom and bust economy and a boom and bust environment. And that's where we keep on getting it wrong, and where governments keep on getting it wrong. There's no analysis of what it means to be good for the economy. Nobody talks about, everyone only ever talks about the size of the economy, but not necessarily the shape of the economy. So if all of these dollars are flowing in, but again, going straight offshore to the shareholders of these particular companies, yes, that might represent growth, but whose growth? Is that for local workers? Is that for Aboriginal corporations? Is that for, and what cost does that represent for the environment as well? And so that happens across the oil and gas sector more broadly, but the Barossa is a prime example of what they're trying to pull at the moment as well. So essentially what we have is a situation where for oil and gas, we're having a very, very low tax rate. So we're not getting a return for the Australian economy, creating very, very few jobs as well, particularly relevant to investment. With that amount of investment in other industries, you could create significantly more jobs as well. And to top it all off, all of these companies have a very bad history of not cleaning up after themselves. So with all of that knowledge, my point, I guess, is why would you? So thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Liam. That was brilliant analysis. I now I'm going to pass over to Dina Rui. I think you've entered the room. So Dina is from Jubilee, Australia Research Centre, which does incredible work and has really been marshalling a lot of effort towards an area of pressure that is increasingly being applied with respect to fossil fuel projects, and that's the issue of international financing of these projects. So I'll pass over to Dina now to speak briefly about that, but I just did want to give her a shout out for her brilliant and collaborative work with respect to the Barossa Project, and mobilising locally, nationally and internationally to try to get a different decision and outcome with respect to the project. So thanks. Over to you, Dina.
Thanks, Kirsty. That was a really kind introduction. Is my sound okay? Can everyone hear me?
Your sound is good, but we can't see you.
Yeah, it's I'm on my, just give me, I'm actually sitting in the car.
Oh.
So we're running a screening at the Ritz Cinema at the moment. So I just jumped out in the car. Yeah, because I think that this is, so important to raise awareness about. So I'll share my screen. Let me, gosh, there we go. Okay, so as Kirsty said, I'll talk about a bit about international public finance and the Barossa Project, and I'll talk about export credit agencies, which is a form of international public finance, and I'll talk about just quickly about their connection to the fossil industry overall, and specifically about the Barossa Project and why they could be a crucial pressure point in stopping this project. So I'll quickly just go through what an export credit agency is, because it is a bit of a black hole that sometimes slip under the radar. And I know that most people don't know what they are. I know that I certainly had no idea what an export credit agency is until I started working for Jubilee Australia. So ECAs are one of the most significant sources of public support for fossil fuels and other extractive industries like non-coal mining, for example. They provide government-backed guarantees, insurance, credits, and loans to support the export of goods and services abroad. So most high-income and increasingly more middle-income countries have an export credit agency. Some countries have two. In Australia, we have one, and that is called Export Finance Australia. Until 2019, it was called EFIC, but they underwent a rebranding in 2019. So just to quickly illustrate how around the world private banks and investors are actually going out of fossil fuels, and governments are now using ECAs to fill the growing finance gap. So the result is effectively that ECAs are financing the climate crisis by financing new fossil fuel developments at an alarming rate. So as you can see in the graph here, which is from a report that Friends of the Earth in the US and Oil Change International published last year. So you can see that in 2016 till 2018, that the G20 ECAs provided $31.6 billion in annual support for the fossil fuel industry. And I just want to highlight that one of the major issues when it comes to ECAs is that they operate with very poor transparency. So it makes it really hard, not impossible, but it's really hard to get accurate statistics on the actual support for fossil fuels. So that means in reality, these numbers could be a lot higher. In any case, let's keep going. So in the next slide here, we can see that 4 countries, Japan, China, Korea, and Canada, they account for 79% of G20 ECA fossil fuel support, which is substantial. And then, so at the top, you have Japan, then you have Korea, and then you have China, and then you have Canada. So moving on to the next slide. So this is just a final thing that I wanted to highlight with regards to export credit agencies. And that is that ECA's support for fossil fuels, it goes beyond just the monetary support. When they support fossil fuels, it sends a signals to investors and it leverages support from the private sector. And the result is that it drives investment in fossil fuel developments that might not have happened if it wasn't for the support for this from these export credit agencies. And then we actually, an hour ago or so, I did get an email from some of our friends in South Korea. So South Korea, they have two ECAs. It's KEXIM and K-Shore, and they provide $5.3 billion US dollars annually to the fossil fuel industry. Both ECAs have provided finance for Australian gas projects, such as the Ichthys LNG projects. And the email I got an hour ago said that they actually just found out that KEXIM has provided $200 million US dollars to the Barossa Project. They don't know yet what exactly this transaction is for, because as I said, there's not a lot of transparency. But we assume that it's for a Korean company called SKENS. So the good thing is that SK's involvement in Barossa contradicts its current transition policy and climate strategy. So we're going to work together with the people on this call and the South Korean group Solutions for our Climate to put pressure on the company. So let's move on to JBIC. So this is one of Japan's two export credit agencies. It's called Japan Bank for International Cooperation. As mentioned, I think previously, Japan provides $7.8 billion US dollars to fossil fuels every year. And I included the map here, which some of our friends in Japan made. And it just shows, the massive support of JBIC to different projects around the world. This is oil, it's gas, it's coal, and it's non-coal mining. And as you can see, a lot of it is for projects in Australia. And in fact, JBIC was the largest lender to oil and gas projects in Australia from 2008 till 2019. It has provided billions of dollars, US dollars, to projects which I'm sure you've all heard about, including the Browse, Ichthys, and Curtis LNG over the last 10 years. I think the total number is around 14 billion US dollars. So in February, which maybe you have mentioned previously in this meeting, and I'm sorry that I couldn't make it, but in February 2021, JBIC actually announced its intention to support Santos Barossa LNG project. So when that happened, two Japanese NGOs called Jaxus and Friends of the Earth, they reached out to Jubilee Australia because we are a part of a global network of NGOs, which is called ECA Watch. And we have for the last few years been working to climate-proof export credit agencies around the world. So our partners in Japan, they reached out because they wanted our help to gather information about this project because they wanted to meet with JBIC. And they also informed us that they are somewhat vulnerable to external pressure from other countries. So they suggested that we write a submission or a type of a formal letter to JBIC. So there was a 45-day deadline to do this. And JBIC can, at any time after the 45-day deadline, announce if they are going to finance the project or not. So they haven't made an announcement yet, and the 45-day limit has passed. And together with the amazing people in this meeting, we did manage to pull together a submission. So I just wanted to specifically say thank you to Liam and Jason. We definitely couldn't have done this without you. So the submission outlines the different concerns that we have with the project, and it's available on our website, and I think it's available on the Environment Centre NT's website as well. So I encourage you to have a look at it. And our partners in Japan, so Friends of the Earth in Japan and Jaxus, they have met with JBIC several times over this project. And a lot of people on this call are going to meet with JBIC next Friday. And it does seem like the pressure that we have applied so far is helping, and it does seem that they do have some concerns. So that's really encouraging news. So I just wanted to finish off by saying that, I mean, I believe that it's very clear to everyone here that the Barossa project should be stopped. And between pressuring the South Korean company and JBIC and potentially other ECAs that might be interested in financing the Barossa project, we believe that we still have a chance of stopping it from moving ahead. So that's all that I had, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Dina. And I sort of feel that that is a somewhat hopeful note to end the presentations on. I've been feeling a little bit dejected lately, particularly after meetings with members of Team Territory who are tasked with reconstructing the Northern Territory's economy so that it's gas-fired effectively. And also watching Four Corners a couple of weeks ago, which of course Bruce featured in. But I guess I just wanted to acknowledge the work of everyone on this call and all across Australia who are fighting against these projects and in new and innovative ways. So yeah, thank you all, and thank you all for being part of this webinar as well. We do have some time for questions, but I'm also aware we've been going for over an hour. So if you would like to ask a question and you're online, just indicate in the chat and I'll hand over to you. We also have people watching from the Lucky Bat Cafe and Bar in Nightcliff, and I'm not sure how they would ask questions, but there is a computer obviously hooked up that they're watching from. So if there are any questions, just indicate now by entering into the chat. But while we're waiting to see if people do ask questions, I just wondered if there was a final comment from each of our panelists. And I guess just thinking about that note of hope, you know, what next for the Barossa project? What should we be focusing our energies on? And, you know, do we have a prospect of stopping this and other polluting carbon intensive projects, fossil fuel projects in Australia? So maybe Jason, you first.
Thanks, Kirsty. I'm trying really hard to think of something positive to say, but it's quite difficult. I really look forward to engaging with the Tiwi Islanders a lot more, and I'd love to be able to explain to them what they're up against here. I honestly don't think they realise what a massive change this means to, you know, the beautiful Tiwi Islands. I don't know if you've seen that film Top End Wedding, where the young Aboriginal lady goes up to the Tiwis and gets married, and you know how beautiful and idyllic it is, and that could be all ruined by this. So.
That's somewhat a hopeful note. Okay, Bruce, over to you.
Oh, I suppose I'm far more hopeful. I was involved in what seemed like a pretty hopeless situation down where I live, on the mid-north coast of New South Wales. AGL had full approval and very strong government backing to build 110 gas wells just upriver from where I live. They had full approval, as I said. It was, you know, gone through all the processes. They were starting to actually frack up there. They'd done a few exploration wells, and so look, it's not over till it's built. Always my view. I mean, it may be approved. They've still got to go through some financing hoops, and you know, I think any great campaign has three levels. You know, you can have, you really need strong on the ground support, to have any chance of success. And so that's what I would urge you to do, organise and campaign and protest and do all the things that people do, and make representations to your EPA, if there actually is one in the Northern Territory.
There is.
There is. Yeah, so you know, like I think all those things need to be done, and you know, it is possible. You know, it can be done and has been done before. As I said, was done in our local region here. So yeah, it's not built until it's built.
Great, thanks, Bruce. Liam?
Yeah, for sure. I'm very hopeful. I think that, you know, to echo what Dina said, there's a lot of potential here to work with our international friends to put a stop to this particular project. But then talking about gas more broadly as well, despite all of the rhetoric that is largely hot air about the gas-fired recovery, particularly from a federal level, we are starting to see a coalition of people from all sides of politics start to come together and call it out for what it is. And so we've seen already Pauline Hanson, for example, in the Senate got up and said that, you know, it's very clear that our offshore oil and gas program doesn't benefit Australia. It actually benefits offshore corporations. Likewise, we've seen Liberal New South Wales Energy Minister Matt Keane say that if you really want to bring down prices and if you really want to help out the environment in that way, you'd be mad to use gas. And so we have likewise the Liberal government in South Australia going down a similar route as well. And then also we've had Chris Bowen, who's made some very promising moves since he's moved into the shadow portfolio for climate and energy. So I think that despite all of the doom and gloom, and I'm sure we're going to see some pretty nasty fossil fuel stuff in the upcoming federal budget, I think that there is hope in the sense that there's a growing coalition of people that are calling it out and saying, you know, we have to put a stop to this madness of not just destroying the environment and the climate through pursuing gas projects, but also the fact that it just doesn't make economic sense anymore. So yeah, I'm very hopeful, and I think that yeah, there's a lot of work to do, but I'm confident that we can all do it. Yeah.
Thanks, Dina.
I guess I just wanted to add one thing, which I'm also hopeful about, is that in within the ECA Watch Network, which consists of, I think, 40 plus organizations from around the world, we've seen a lot of ECAs move just the last couple of months. And there's actually a growing appetite within that network to use Barossa as an example of an LNG project that should not be supported by ECAs. So I think that having that international pressure as well is really encouraging. Yeah.
Great. Piers from the Conservation Council of WA said we've been fighting these sorts of offshore gas projects for years and they can be stopped. And I just want to say also from a sort of the Environment Centre's perspective, we've got another question asking, does the international law of the sea apply here? And this is the question of like the legal and regulatory framework around this particular project is something that the Environment Centre is looking very closely at, together with the Environmental Defender's Office. We have been engaged in the approvals process so far, but we don't think this is a done deal. There are outstanding approvals. So in terms of the laws that apply, there is, of course, it's an offshore project. And so the Offshore Petroleum Greenhouse Gas Storage Act applies. NOPSEMA is the relevant regulator of the actual sort of offshore wells and the pipeline. But for the Darwin LNG processing facility, it's Northern Territory law, and the Waste Management and Pollution Control Act applies. There's an environment protection licence in place, which is quite old now and expires in the next year or two. It was about the Bayu Undan field. It does not cover the Barossa field. And so we're currently investigating, you know, what the levers might be in that regard and think that there's actually some way to go with approvals, although we're currently investigating that. So I don't know, in response to the question about does the international law of the sea apply, I think it depends what particular components of the law of the sea you're talking about. But we're certainly investigating these avenues currently right now as part of our investigations into this, and are very interested in organising a campaign around the Barossa Project specifically, because all the focus is on the Beetaloo, and there are other far more immediate threats such as this particular project. I don't know if there are any other questions in the chat. Does anyone else want to have any comments thrown in about similar battles, for instance, in WA peers, or
Kirsty, can I just jump in there?
Yeah.
I just want to remind people about that epic battle we had 5 years in Broome against Woodside, and we ended up winning the day and protecting James Price's points. So it can be done. I will be positive.
Yeah, I was going to mention that the same campaign, and there's been others. And I think one of the learnings from these sorts of campaigns is it's usually not one thing that wins. It's a whole range of different tactics and pressure points that are brought to bear. At the end of the day, it was a legal challenge that overturned the environmental approval for James Price Point. And I would encourage you guys to engage some good lawyers if you haven't already. But that was just one aspect of the campaign. There were other dimensions to it, but I think that this is definitely worth putting some effort behind. You're talking about, what is it, about 6 million tonnes of CO2 every year that can be stopped. And yeah, there's probably not many other opportunities around the world or in Australia to create that much savings in CO2. So I just encourage people to get behind any efforts to stop these kinds of projects. It's not going to be very long before they're just not going to be feasible. And arguably that is already the case now. But unfortunately, some of the capital that these companies have is pretty irrational in the way that it kind of gets used. But yeah, I think we're certainly seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, but it's going to take a bit of effort just now in the meantime to stop some of these last mega projects from going ahead.
Great, thanks so much. There is one other question which again pertains to sort of other legal frameworks, and I'm not across these in any way, shape or form, and probably should be. But there's a comment from someone at Lucky Bat who is an expert in this area, in particular, the marine area between Timor and Australia, who has asked, and Jason, I just wonder if this is something you might have some knowledge of. The Arafura Timor Sea is a semi-enclosed sea and requires a commitment to consult with close countries. And is that, I'm not aware of that obligation or that particular sort of regulatory lens. Have you encountered that before, or have anything you want to say about that?
As far as I'm aware, this project is well and truly within the Australian exclusive economic zone, so we probably don't need to, you know, have a chat with Indonesia about it. It's not in the treaty area with Timor that a lot of the other gas projects are in, like the Northern Endeavour, which we discussed earlier. That's in the treaty area, so that would be different. But pretty sure Barossa's in the Australian zone. So
we can certainly have a discussion with that expert who's Darwin-based in the future. Okay, well, look, it's 7:15 in Darwin at any rate, and it's later where other people are located and watching this Zoom from. But I just wanted to thank everyone who has participated and presented this evening. It's been a really fantastic webinar, very informative. I've learned a lot, and yeah, again, I'm feeling a sense of hope at the end of it. So thank you all so much for being part of this, and we look forward to future collaborations about this and other projects. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kirsty.
Thank you.
thanks, everyone.